My name is Caleb. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of man people describe as steady, not loud, not dramatic. The one who shows up early, leaves late, and doesn't need to be asked twice. I work with numbers for a living, quiet work, behind screens and spreadsheets. And I've always been more comfortable letting results speak than explaining myself out loud. If you asked people who knew me back then, they'd probably say I was lucky. A stable job, a marriage that looked calm from the outside, no scandals, no visible chaos. The kind of life that doesn't attract attention. And maybe that's why I was underestimated. Not because I was weak, but because I didn't announce my strength. I didn't correct people when they assumed I was easygoing to the point of passivity. I let them believe that. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not a story about winning either, at least not in the way the internet usually defines it. It's about trust, and what happens when trust is misplaced in the most intimate place possible. It's about money, yes, but only because money has a way of revealing truths that words can hide for years. At the center of this story is a sentence I never imagined I'd say out loud. I trusted my wife with our savings, and then the account went down to zero. There's no clickbait in that, no exaggeration, just a fact that split my life in two, before and after. Another truth took longer to admit, even to myself. Love didn't prepare me for financial betrayal. I believed emotional closeness was protection enough. I believed that shared dreams automatically meant shared responsibility. I was wrong, and not in a sudden, cinematic way. The damage came quietly, transaction by transaction, explanation by explanation, until one day, the numbers no longer made sense. What you're about to hear is not a blow-by-blow expose. I'm not here to shame anyone or turn private pain into spectacle. This is a documentary-style account of how subtle disrespect becomes normalized, how silence can be mistaken for weakness, and how clarity, real clarity, often arrives without drama. You'll hear about the version of me people thought they knew, about the small moments everyone else ignored, about the shift that happened long before any confrontation, when I stopped reacting and started observing, and about the choices I made quietly, deliberately, once I understood the full picture. There's no shouting in this story, no slammed doors, no miraculous turnaround, just decisions, consequences, and an outcome that couldn't be undone once it was set in motion. I'm telling this now because I know how isolating it feels to realize you've been betrayed in a way that doesn't leave bruises, only balance sheets and doubt. And because somewhere out there is someone who's being told they're overthinking numbers that don't add up. So before we go any further, let me ask you, gently and honestly, have you ever trusted someone so completely that you ignored the quiet voice asking you to look again? For a long time, I was the reliable one, not the visionary, not the risk taker, just the man who made sure things didn't fall apart. In our marriage, that role fit me neatly, or at least it looked like it did from the outside. I handled logistics, paperwork. Most people want to outsource or avoid. Bills were paid on time, taxes filed early, emergencies were planned for, even if they never came. My wife used to joke that I was the safety net, and I took that as a compliment. At the time, I thought that was love speaking. Among friends and family, I was easy to overlook. I didn't dominate conversations. I listened more than I talked. When decisions were made, I was often the one nodding, saying, "That works for me," not because I didn't have opinions, but because I didn't feel the need to compete for space. I believed competence didn't need an audience. That belief shaped how people treated me. At gatherings, I'd be asked practical questions about interest rates, contracts, timelines, then quietly dismissed when the real discussions began. I noticed it, but I didn't resent it. I told myself everyone plays a role, mine just happened to be stability. In my marriage, that same pattern deepened. My wife was charismatic, expressive, and confident in a way that drew people toward her. She spoke with certainty, even when she was improvising. I admired that. I trusted it. When she said she wanted to manage our savings, investments, transfers, long-term planning, it felt natural to step back. She seemed energized by it. I was relieved not to be the one making those calls. People assume trust is loud. That's announced. But for me, trust was quiet. It was handing over access without checking behind it. It was believed that shared intentions were enough. If I'm honest, I think everyone, including her, saw me as incapable of suspicion, the kind of man who wouldn't question too closely, not because I was foolish, but because I was agreeable. predictable, safe. And I reinforced that image without realizing it. When friends teased me about being low maintenance, I smiled. When family members praised my wife for being the organized one, I didn't correct them. It was easier to let assumptions stand than to reframe the narrative. I didn't need credit. I didn't need control, or so I thought. What I didn't see at the time was how invisibility can become permission. Permission to decide without consulting. Permission to explain later instead of before. Permission to assume I'd accept whatever version of events I was given. I wasn't disrespected openly. That would have been easier to confront. Instead, I was gently bypassed. My role was to support, not to oversee, to trust, not to verify. And because I never raised my voice, never challenged authority, that role hardened into expectation. Looking back, I understand something I couldn't articulate then. People rarely test boundaries with force at first. They test them with omission. They see what you notice. They see what you ignore. And most importantly, they see what you tolerate. At that stage of my life, I tolerated a lot. Not out of fear, but out of faith. Faith in love. Faith in partnership. Faith that being steady was enough to be respected. That version of me wasn't weak, but he was visible only in function, not in authority. Useful, not central. Trusted with responsibility, but not with truth. And no one, least of all me, questioned that arrangement. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It almost never is. It came in the form of a delay, small enough to dismiss, ordinary enough to explain away. I'd asked, casually, about moving a portion of our savings into a different account. Not urgently, just a routine question, the kind couples ask each other all the time. My wife nodded, said she'd take care of it, and the conversation moved on. Weeks passed. When I asked again, she laughed lightly, the way people do when they think you're being overly cautious. "You worry too much," she said. "Everything's fine, I'm handling it." That should have been nothing. And in the moment, I treated it as nothing. I trusted her. More than that, I trusted the version of us I believed in, so I let it go. But I remembered it. I've always had a habit of mentally bookmarking moments that don't quite settle right, not because I'm suspicious by nature, but because patterns matter to me. In my work, a single outlier doesn't mean much. 2 can be a coincidence. 3 is where you start paying attention. This was the first. A month later, I noticed a transfer I didn't recognize. It wasn't large, a few $100s, easily explained as a fee or a temporary move between accounts. When I asked about it, she didn't get defensive. She didn't get angry. She explained it smoothly, too smoothly, maybe, and reminded me that she'd taken over the financial details so I wouldn't have to stress about them. "Trust me," she said. "That's the whole point." I told myself she was right, that my question had been unnecessary. I even apologized for doubting, for intruding into something I'd already delegated. The conversation ended with a smile and a kiss, and for anyone watching, it would have looked like a healthy exchange. But something shifted internally. Not an alarm, not fear, just a faint awareness that I'd crossed an invisible line by asking. That curiosity in this area was being framed as distrust, and I didn't like how quickly I accepted that framing. Still, I said nothing. Friends wouldn't have noticed, even if I'd told them. Small discrepancies don't sound alarming when spoken aloud. "Maybe I'm just being paranoid," I would have said, and they would have agreed, so I kept it to myself. Then came the comment. We were having dinner with friends, talking loosely about future plans. Someone asked about long-term goals, travel, property, retirement. My wife answered confidently, outlining ideas I'd never heard before. Timelines, numbers, assumptions. She spoke as if we'd agreed on all of it. I smiled and nodded. It wasn't the place to interrupt. On the drive home, I mentioned it gently, not accusatory, just curious. She sighed, an almost imperceptible sound, but loaded. "I didn't think you'd mind," she said. "You're not really into that stuff anyway." That was the cut. Small, clean, easy to ignore. Except it wasn't true. I was into that stuff. I always had been. I just hadn't insisted on being visible about it. And now, that invisibility was being used as evidence against me, proof that my involvement wasn't necessary. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I let the moment pass. But something fundamental changed in how I listened after that. I started hearing what was being said between explanations, not lies, at least not yet, but assumptions. About my role, about my limits, about what I would or wouldn't question. Everyone else saw a calm marriage, a capable partner handling finances, a husband who trusted his wife completely. What they didn't see was the first incision, the moment trust shifted from shared to managed, from mutual to unilateral, a moment so small it left no visible scar, but deep enough to register. And once you feel that, you don't forget it. After the first cut, nothing exploded. That's how normalization works. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly. Like background noise, you stop noticing until someone points it out. The small moments began to stack. I'd ask a question about an account balance, and the answer would come later than promised. I'd mention a statement I hadn't seen, and she'd say it was probably nothing, or that the bank interface was confusing. Each explanation, taken alone, made sense. Together, they formed a pattern I didn't yet want to name. What changed wasn't her behavior, as much as my position in it. I was no longer being informed, I was being reassured. And reassurance is different from transparency. Whenever I pressed, gently, carefully, the tone shifted, not to anger, but to disappointment, as if I'd failed a test I didn't know I was taking. The test was simple. Do you trust me or not? And every time I asked for details, I was choosing the wrong answer. So I adapted. I started framing my questions as hypotheticals. What if we wanted to? Or, out of curiosity. I softened my voice. I smiled more. I learned to make my concern sound like ignorance rather than awareness. And she responded better to that, more patient, more generous with surface-level explanations. That should have bothered me more than it did. Instead, I rationalized it. I told myself she was under pressure, that managing finances can be stressful, that my role, as a supportive partner, was to reduce friction, not create it. I'd been praised my whole life for being easy to work with. I didn't want to become difficult now. So when she made decisions without telling me, I let it pass. When she summarized instead of showing me numbers, I accepted it. When she joked lightly that I'd zone out if she explained everything, I laughed along. Each time, I felt something tighten inside me, but I ignored it. That's the dangerous part of quiet disrespect. It doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like erosion. You don't defend against it because there's nothing obvious to defend against. Just tone, timing, assumptions. Friends reinforced it without meaning to. They'd comment on how lucky I was to have someone else handle the financial stress, how calm I seemed because of it. I nodded, played the part. I didn't want to be the man who complained about a good thing. And somewhere along the way, my silence was reinterpreted as consent. Not consent to outcomes, but consent to exclusion. I noticed how often decisions were framed as already done by the time I heard about them. How explanations came packaged with a subtle message. This was easier without involving you, and because I didn't object strongly, the message stuck. I told myself I was choosing peace, that confrontation over small things would only damage trust, that love meant giving space. What I didn't realize was that I was slowly being trained to accept summaries instead of details, trained to doubt my instincts, trained to believe that asking questions was a flaw in my character, not a responsibility I'd neglected. And the more I accepted that training, the easier it became for everyone else to assume I didn't need to know. By the time I started feeling uneasy on a regular basis, the disrespect had already been normalized, not through cruelty, but through repetition, through the quiet understanding that I wouldn't push too hard, that I'd prioritize harmony over clarity. I still trusted her, that's important to say. This wasn't paranoia or jealousy, it was something subtler and more dangerous, misplaced patience. Because when you normalize being dismissed, you stop noticing when the stakes rise. And they were rising. There's a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when you realize you've been cast in a role you never auditioned for. Not because someone announced it, but because everyone starts behaving as if the script is already written. For me, that role was simple, dependable, agreeable, and peripheral. I was the man you could count on to support decisions, not shape them. The one who would absorb consequences without needing explanations. Useful in execution, unnecessary in strategy. I didn't hear this stated outright. I felt it in the way conversations flowed around me instead of through me. When financial plans were discussed, they were presented as conclusions, not proposals. When I raised concerns, they were acknowledged politely, then bypassed. My input wasn't rejected, it just wasn't required. At some point, my wife stopped saying "we decided" and started saying "I've got it handled." The language shift was subtle, but consistent. And language, I've learned, is where power quietly rearranges itself. I told myself this was efficiency. Two people don't need to do the same job, that my strength was in providing stability, not direction. I believed being needed was enough, even if I wasn't being consulted. But roles, once assigned, come with expectations. I was expected to be calm when numbers were vague, understanding when timelines changed, supportive when plans evolved without discussion. And because I fulfilled those expectations without resistance, the role solidified. What I didn't see then was how easily reliability can be mistaken for compliance. How silence becomes confirmation, how being low maintenance turns into being invisible. The clearest sign came during a routine conversation, one I still replay sometimes. I asked if we could review our long-term savings together, not because I suspected anything specific, but because I wanted to re-anchor myself in the details. She paused, then said, "You don't need to worry about that. That's my thing." My thing, not ours. The words landed softly, but they carried weight. They defined a boundary I hadn't agreed to. And when I didn't challenge it, that boundary became real. I started noticing how often my calmness was used as justification. "You're so relaxed about this," she'd say when I asked for clarity, as if my temperament disqualified me from involvement, as if concern belonged only to those who expressed it loudly. I wasn't angry, I was something else, displaced. I still did what I'd always done, showed up, paid attention, kept my life organized. From the outside, nothing had changed. But internally, a quiet awareness was forming. I was no longer a partner in this area of our life. I was a beneficiary, one who wasn't allowed to audit. And beneficiaries don't ask questions. The role I'd been assigned came with one unspoken rule: trust without verification. And as long as I played it well, everything would remain fine. I didn't yet know how high the stakes had become. I didn't know what was already happening behind the scenes. All I knew was that my presence had been reduced to function, not authority. Reliable, useful, invisible. And for the first time, I understood that invisibility isn't neutral. It creates space for things to grow unchecked. That realization didn't make me act, not yet. But it changed how I watched. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic reveal. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a moment so quiet it almost didn't register as important. I was home earlier than usual that day. Work had wrapped up fast, and the apartment was still, the kind of stillness that makes you aware of small sounds. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic outside. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't suspicious. I was simply present. On the kitchen counter sat my wife's laptop, open but dimmed, the screen just beginning to go dark. Beside it was a folder I didn't recognize, not hidden, not protected, just there. I didn't touch anything. That's important. This wasn't the moment I discovered the truth. It was the moment I realized how far removed I'd become from it. I stood there longer than necessary, looking at an object that represented an entire part of our shared life, one I was no longer invited into, and instead of feeling the urge to confront or investigate, I felt something else entirely: clarity. Not about what she was doing, but about what I needed to do. I saw myself from the outside then, a man who'd been careful not to overstep, careful not to question too hard, careful not to disrupt the image of harmony we'd built. And I understood suddenly that my caution had nothing to do with trust anymore. It was about avoiding discomfort. That realization was uncomfortable enough to break something open. I went to the window and stood there, hands in my pockets, watching people pass on the street below. Strangers, all carrying private realities no one else could see. I thought about how often I'd mistaken quiet for safety, how often I'd equated calm with honesty. And in that moment, I made a decision, not an action, but a shift in posture. I stopped assuming, I stopped excusing, I stopped telling myself I'd deal with it later. There was no anger in that decision, no resentment, just a clear understanding that responsibility deferred is responsibility abandoned. When my wife came home later, I didn't mention the laptop. I didn't ask new questions. I behaved exactly as I always had, and that was the point. Nothing changed on the surface, but internally I crossed a line. From that day on, I stopped seeing my silence as patience. I started seeing it as a choice. And choices can be revised. I didn't know what I would find if I looked more closely. I didn't know how far things had gone. I didn't even know if something was truly wrong yet. But I knew one thing with certainty: I would no longer remain blind, out of habit. That afternoon wasn't the beginning of action, it was the end of denial. And once denial ends, everything else becomes possible. After that afternoon, my silence changed texture. From the outside, nothing was different. I still listened, I still nodded, I still played the role that had been assigned to me so smoothly that no one thought to question it. But internally, silence was no longer avoidance, it was strategy. I stopped asking questions out loud. That wasn't surrender, it was calibration. I wanted to understand the full shape of the situation before reacting to any single detail. In my line of work, premature conclusions create noise. Clarity comes from patterns, not impulses. So I let the environment remain exactly as it was, because any change in my behavior might change the behavior around me. And people behave most honestly when they believe nothing is wrong. My wife continued to manage our finances with confidence. She spoke freely, casually, sometimes carelessly. When you believe someone isn't watching, you stop editing yourself. You simplify, you summarize, you assume. I noticed how often she said things like, "It's complicated," or "You wouldn't want to deal with this," not defensively, almost kindly, as if protecting me from something unpleasant. I accepted those statements with a smile. Inside, I cataloged them. Silence gave me something I hadn't had before: perspective. I started noticing timing, how explanations always arrived after decisions, how details were offered only when I asked, and even then, selectively, how certainty in her tone increased as my curiosity decreased. Others misread my silence completely. Friends commented on how calm I was, how unbothered. Someone once said, "I wish I could just let things go as you do." I almost laughed. Letting go wasn't what I was doing. I was paying attention. What surprised me most was how little effort it took to be underestimated. Once you've been placed in that category, people don't double-check with the person they assume won't object. They don't conceal as carefully. They don't anticipate resistance. Silence, when chosen, is disarming. I began documenting, not in any official way, just notes, dates, phrases that stuck out, not accusations, just observations. I wasn't building a case yet, I was building context. At night, lying in bed, I replayed conversations with new ears, not to catch lies, but to understand assumptions about me, about our partnership, about accountability. And slowly, something else happened. My emotions steadied. The anxiety I'd felt earlier, the low-grade unease, began to fade. Not because things were better, but because uncertainty was being replaced by intention. I no longer needed immediate reassurance. I needed accuracy. I didn't feel powerful. I felt grounded. Silence stopped being something that happened to me. It became something I used deliberately, a way to let the situation reveal itself without interference. If my wife noticed the change, she didn't mention it. Why would she? From her perspective, everything was smoother than ever. No questions, no tension, no friction. That's the paradox of quiet dominance. It looks like absence until it isn't. I wasn't preparing to confront. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was aligning myself with reality, whatever it turned out to be. And reality has a way of surfacing when you stop rushing it. What they never noticed was how methodical I am when I stop talking. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to investigate. That word implies drama. What I did was quieter, slower, and far more effective. I returned to habits I'd always had, habits no one paid attention to because they didn't look like action. I observed. I started with my own routines, when statements usually arrived, when notifications didn't, which explanations were repeated verbatim, and which ones evolved slightly each time they were told. Consistency is comforting, but variation is informative. I noticed how often phrases like temporary, just until, and it'll balance out appeared. None of those are lies on their own, but together they signal postponement, answers pushed forward, clarity delayed. I began keeping notes in my leather notebook, not judgments, just facts, dates, amounts when mentioned casually. Decisions are described in passing. I didn't need full access to see trends. You can learn a lot from the edges of a system. At work, I deal with financial processes that fail not because of one big mistake, but because of many small ones that compound unnoticed. I applied that same lens here, not emotionally, analytically. I educated myself quietly on joint account protections, authorization structures, and reporting timelines. Not because I planned to act immediately, but because I wanted to understand what should have been visible to me all along. No browser history left open, no questions asked aloud, no behavior that would suggest suspicion. The irony is this. People often think secrecy requires effort. It doesn't. If the other person assumes you're uninterested, the more I stayed in my assigned role, the more freely information flowed around me without being filtered. I noticed new patterns in conversation. When money came up around others, my wife spoke with increased confidence, sometimes embellishing outcomes that hadn't materialized yet. Optimism framed as certainty. I didn't correct her. I also noticed something subtler, how often she spoke for me, about what I wanted, what I was comfortable with, what I didn't care about. Each time, I said nothing. Silence created space. Space revealed habits. Habits revealed the truth. Late at night, when the apartment was quiet, I'd review my notes. Not with dread, but with calm focus. I wasn't trying to prove wrongdoing. I was trying to understand the scope, scale, direction. Was this mismanagement, overconfidence, or something else entirely? I didn't jump to conclusions because I didn't need to. The process itself was stabilizing. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting to fragments. I was building a whole picture, piece by piece. What no one noticed, what they couldn't have noticed, was that my stillness wasn't passive anymore. It was deliberate positioning. I wasn't waiting to be hurt. I wasn't hoping things would improve on their own. I was preparing to see clearly. And once clarity arrives, it doesn't announce itself with panic. It arrives quietly, and it doesn't leave. The reveal didn't come all at once. It never does when you're paying attention. It came in fragments that, on their own, still could have been explained away. A missing statement here, a balance that didn't align with the timeline I had reconstructed there, numbers that weren't alarming until you placed them next to each other and asked one simple question. Where did the margin go? I remember the exact evening when the picture finally locked into place. I was alone, sitting at the small desk by the window, my notebook open in front of me. The city outside was quiet in that late-hour way. Lights on, movement slowed, everything softened. I wasn't tense, I wasn't rushing. I was simply cross-checking what I already knew against what I was now able to confirm. That's when I saw it. Not a single catastrophic transfer, not a dramatic withdrawal, but a pattern of depletion so consistent it could no longer be accidental. Money moved out in amounts designed not to trigger attention, just under thresholds, spread across time. Each instance is defensible, collectively undeniable. I didn't feel anger. That surprised me. What I felt was a kind of stillness, heavy but clean, the kind that arrives when ambiguity finally ends. When the question shifts from is something wrong to how long has this been happening, I traced it back as far as I could without alerting anyone. Months, then longer. I compared dates to conversations I'd noted, moments when I'd been reassured, times I'd been told everything was fine. It wasn't just that the money was gone. It was that I'd been managed while it happened. Every reassurance now had context. Every delay had a purpose. Every time I'd been made to feel intrusive for asking, suddenly it made sense. I closed the notebook and sat there for a long time. No celebration, no rush to confront, no urge to call anyone, just a clear understanding that the situation had crossed from misalignment into betrayal. Not emotional betrayal, financial betrayal, the kind that doesn't announce itself with infidelity or drama, but with silence and omission. I trusted my wife with our savings, and then the account went down to zero. Seeing the truth privately was important. It meant no one else could shape my reaction. There was no audience, no pressure to perform grief or anger correctly, just me and the facts. And the facts were enough. I also understood something else in that moment. Whatever I chose next would be irreversible. Once knowledge enters a relationship like this, you can't return to ignorance. You can only decide how quietly or how loudly you'll move forward. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was spiraling, but because my mind was organizing, laying out options, testing outcomes, removing paths that would cost me my integrity. I wasn't interested in punishment. I wasn't interested in humiliation. I was interested in alignment with the truth and with myself. By morning, the shock had passed. What remained was clarity, and clarity demands a decision. The hardest part wasn't discovering what had happened. It was realizing that no option left me untouched. Once clarity settles in, it doesn't come with instructions. It just sits there, heavy and unmovable, waiting for you to decide who you're going to be now that you know the truth. And that night, really, that long stretch between night and morning, I walked every possible path forward until each one revealed its cost. I didn't rush. I couldn't afford to. I listed the options the way I've always done when the stakes are high, not emotionally, structurally. Option 1. Confront immediately. Sit her down. Show what I knew. Demand explanations, timelines, and accountability. It would feel honest, direct. It would also hand over control of the narrative at the exact moment emotions would be highest. Once you confront too early, you lose the ability to observe. Everything becomes reactive, defensive, contaminated by urgency. I imagined her response. Not the worst-case version, the realistic one. Shock, denial, tears framed as misunderstanding, maybe even genuine regret. And then what? Promises, partial truths, damage control. I'd be forced to decide in the heat of that moment whether to believe her again or harden myself permanently. I crossed that option out, not because confrontation was wrong, but because timing matters more than righteousness. Option 2, do nothing, absorb the loss, treat it as an expensive lesson, stay married, rebuild slowly, protect future income, avoid destruction. This option looked mature on the surface, forgiving even, but when I sat with it honestly, I realized what it required. Swallowing the knowledge that I had been deliberately excluded while something fundamental was taken from me. It required normalizing betrayal as a mistake instead of a choice. And more than that, it required me to become smaller. To accept a version of myself who could be managed again, just more carefully this time. That cost was too high. I crossed that out too. Option 3. Retaliate emotionally. Expose her. Shame on her. Tell friends. Tell family. Burn the image she'd built. This was the option my anger briefly flirted with, even though I didn't feel rage the way people expect. I understood the appeal, visibility, validation. A sense of justice is enforced socially, but humiliation isn't justice. It's noise, and noise benefits the person who can cry the loudest, not the one who's right. I had no interest in becoming reactive. I wanted resolution, not spectacle. Crossed out. Option 4. Act quietly, legally, financially, strategically. Say nothing until every move is irreversible. This option didn't promise comfort, it promised coherence. It required patience, discipline, the ability to sit across from someone who believed everything was fine, while knowing the ground beneath the relationship had already shifted. It required me to separate my internal reality from my external behavior completely. Most people can't do that. I could. I didn't choose this option immediately. I tested it against my moral code, the one thing I hadn't compromised yet. I asked myself hard questions. Am I trying to punish her or protect myself? Am I acting out of fear or out of clarity? Will I respect myself when this is over? The answers came slowly, but they were consistent. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to exit with integrity intact. That distinction mattered, because quiet action isn't about domination. It's about containment. It's about preventing further damage while minimizing collateral harm. It's about refusing to let someone else's choices force you into becoming someone you don't recognize. By early morning, I understood something else that surprised me. I wasn't grieving the money as much as I was grieving the illusion. The illusion that love automatically protects shared resources. The illusion that trust, once earned, doesn't need structure. The illusion that being calm makes you safe. That grief needed space, and space required distance, emotional first, logistical second, so I began mapping the irreversible path. Not steps yet, just principles. No confrontation until I was legally and financially insulated. No emotional disclosures that could be used to rewrite the narrative. No actions that violated my own standards, even if they were tempting. This wasn't about revenge, it was about control, of myself, of the process, of the ending. I also accepted a difficult truth at this stage. Once I moved forward, the marriage I thought I had was already over. Even if we stayed together on paper for a time, the dynamic couldn't return to what it was. Trust, once replaced by monitoring, is already gone. That realization didn't break me. It steadied me. There's a strange calm that comes when you stop trying to save something that no longer exists. When you stop negotiating with the past and start designing the future based on facts, not hopes. I looked at my wife that morning as she went about her routine, coffee, phone, keys, unaware that the version of me she understood had quietly stepped aside, not vanished, evolved. She still saw the reliable man, the agreeable one, the one who didn't ask too many questions. What she didn't see was that reliability had shifted direction. It no longer pointed toward preserving the relationship at all costs. It pointed toward preserving my agency. That's when the decision became final. I would move in silence. I would secure my position. I would let outcomes speak instead of accusations. Not because she deserved kindness, but because I did. And once that decision was settled, there was no inner conflict left, just execution. The point of no return isn't loud. It's the moment when doubt disappears, not replaced by certainty about outcomes, but by certainty about who you are willing to be. For me, that was the moment I chose myself without hatred. And once that choice is made, everything that follows becomes surprisingly simple. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel urgency. Urgency is a form of panic, and panic creates mistakes. What I felt instead was precision. I started with separation, not emotional, but structural. I opened a new account in my own name, one she had no reason to notice. I redirected future income quietly, incrementally, the way you shift weight without making noise. Nothing dramatic enough to raise suspicion, just enough to establish independence. At work, I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor I'd used years earlier. Not framed as a crisis, just a review. Professionals hear tone before they hear facts, and I kept my tone neutral. Together, we outlined what protection looked like from this point forward, what could be preserved, what was already gone, and what steps would prevent further exposure. I didn't tell friends, I didn't tell family. Information spreads faster than intent, and I wasn't ready for either to be questioned. At home, I remained exactly the same. That was the most difficult part, not because it hurt, but because it required discipline. I listened, I responded, I participated in daily life without signaling internal change. I didn't withdraw affection or create distance that would invite questions. People assume silence equals confusion. They rarely suspect resolution. I gathered documents slowly, not all at once. Anything that might matter later was duplicated and stored securely. Statements, agreements, digital records. I treated it the way I treat any system under review. Assume nothing will be accessible later unless preserved now. Still, no confrontation. The absence of drama worked in my favor. My wife relaxed further. When you believe everything is stable, you stop guarding details. Explanations became looser, timelines vaguer, confidence replaced caution. I watched without reacting. This wasn't deception, it was containment. I wasn't lying about facts. I was withholding conclusions, and there's a difference. One corrodes character, the other protects it. Weeks passed like this, outwardly normal, internally decisive. What struck me most was how unnoticed my shift was. I had imagined, once, that moving quietly would feel tense, like walking on thin ice. Instead, it felt grounded, purposeful. Every step aligned with the same objective, no more surprises. I didn't feel powerful, I felt responsible. Responsibility isn't loud, it doesn't demand recognition, it just does the work. By the time the groundwork was laid, there was nothing left to improvise. No emotional appeals could derail what had already been set in motion. No explanations could change the structure I'd built quietly beneath the surface. I hadn't taken anything from her, I had simply stopped being exposed. And when exposure ends, consequences begin, whether anyone notices yet or not. Consequences rarely arrive with announcements. They arrive as absences. At first, nothing seemed different. Life continued in its familiar rhythm. Morning routines, shared meals, casual conversations about plans that now existed only in theory. From the outside, the marriage still looked intact, functional, calm. But beneath that surface, the system had changed. The first consequence appeared as confusion. My wife mentioned casually that a transfer had taken longer than expected. She said it with mild annoyance, not concern. Systems glitch, banks delay. These things happen. I nodded, offered sympathy, and didn't ask questions. A week later, the annoyance returned, sharper this time. Something about an account not behaving the way it should. She checked her phone more often, made calls in other rooms. Her confidence remained, but it had lost its ease. I noticed how often she rechecked numbers she used to recite effortlessly. What was happening wasn't punishment, it was friction. The quiet safeguards I'd put in place had changed the flow of resources. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to interrupt momentum, enough to expose how dependent certain choices had been on my passive participation. She felt the loss before she understood it. That's how these things work. Effects surface before causes are identified. I stayed neutral, supportive, even. I said things like, "That's frustrating," or, "I'm sure it'll sort itself out." Not to manipulate, but because I wasn't ready to reveal anything yet. My role, for now, was still observation, and observation taught me something important. When pressure increased, explanations became inconsistent. She began revising past statements, minimizing earlier confidence, reframing decisions as temporary experiments instead of deliberate plans. I didn't challenge any of it, I just listened. The stress didn't make her cruel, it made her scatter. Sleep became lighter, conversation shorter. She'd pause mid-sentence, as if recalculating internally. The person who once spoke in polished certainty now spoke in qualifiers. Maybe, probably, it should. I felt no satisfaction watching this, only confirmation. The second consequence was silence. Not from me, from her. She stopped volunteering information, stopped narrating financial updates the way she once had. Not because things were resolved, but because the story was harder to tell now. When narratives break down, people retreat. Still, no confrontation. I knew this phase mattered. This was the point where panic could have pushed her toward honesty, or deeper concealment. Either way, my advantage came from not forcing an outcome prematurely. I wasn't here to corner her. I was here to let reality apply its own pressure. And it was. Because once money stops behaving predictably, people start questioning assumptions they didn't even know they were making. The assumption that access would always be there, that buffers would absorb mistakes, that someone else's steadiness would continue indefinitely. That steadiness, mine, had been redirected. The marriage didn't crack outwardly during this time. No fights, no accusations. Just a subtle imbalance that couldn't be named yet. She felt it, I could tell. She just didn't know where it was coming from. That's the thing about quiet action. It doesn't scream that something is wrong. It whispers something has changed. And once change begins, denial becomes exhausting. By the time panic arrived, the window for fixing anything had already closed. It didn't announce itself as panic at first. It came disguised as urgency, sudden bursts of activity, late-night emails, phone calls made with the door closed. I could hear it in her voice when she spoke to customer service. The forced calm layered over strain. The confidence she once carried so easily now required effort. She started asking questions, not of me, around me. Questions framed as hypotheticals. What would you do if? Or, have you ever noticed? She was probing, searching for a way to regain footing without exposing how unstable things had become. I answered neutrally, thoughtfully, never revealing more than necessary. I wasn't withholding to be cruel. I was withholding because disclosure wouldn't have changed the outcome. That's the truth most people struggle with. There's a point where explanation no longer repairs anything. It only rearranges blame. One evening, she sat across from me at the table and finally said it out loud. Not the full truth, just the edge of it. There's been some misalignment with the accounts, she said, choosing the word carefully. Nothing major, just something I'm working through. I looked at her and saw exhaustion where certainty used to be. I nodded. Okay, I said, and meant it. That response unsettled her more than anger would have. She waited for questions, for concern, for guidance. When none came, she filled the silence with explanations that contradicted ones I'd heard months earlier. That was when regret surfaced. Not clean regret, not accountability, but the realization that control had slipped away and couldn't be recovered through narrative alone. You can't talk your way out of structural consequences. She suggested starting fresh, reorganizing, reviewing everything together. The words came quickly, overlapping, as if speed could reverse time. I listened and said nothing, because the truth was simple. Starting fresh requires something to start from, and there was nothing left to rebuild with. The savings were gone, the trust was gone, and the opportunity for transparency had expired long before she decided to offer it. What she wanted now wasn't partnership, it was a rescue. And rescue, at this stage, would have meant accepting responsibility for damage I didn't cause. Becoming, once again, the stabilizing force absorbing loss so the system could continue unchanged. I couldn't do that anymore. The regret became visible in small ways. Apologies that stopped short of specifics. reassurances that arrive too late, promises framed around future behavior rather than past choices. But repair requires more than intention. It requires timing, and timing had been ignored when it mattered. By the time she was ready to explain everything, there was nothing left to negotiate. The consequences had already taken root, quietly and completely. Not because I rushed, but because I didn't. The confrontation didn't begin with a sit-down. It began with permission. Not permission from her, permission from myself to speak without needing anything back. I chose a morning that looked like every other morning. No anniversaries, no deadlines, no symbolic weight. Just coffee cooling on the counter and sunlight flattening the room into honest shapes. I wanted neutrality, not as a tactic, but as a condition. When I spoke, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't pace, I didn't preface anything with emotion. I simply said her name, waited until she looked up, and asked if we could talk. She nodded immediately, too quickly. She had been waiting. I sat across from her, hands open, posture relaxed. That detail mattered. To me, I didn't want my body to contradict my intention. Calm isn't a performance if it's real. I know the savings are gone, I said. No build-up, no qualifiers, no accusations. The sentence landed and stayed where it fell. She didn't respond right away. Her face shifted through a series of expressions that would have looked dramatic to anyone else. To me, they were informational. Surprise that wasn't surprise. Fear that wasn't panic yet. Calculation. Relief, briefly, because at least the waiting was over. I was going to tell you, she said. I nodded once. I know. That answer disarmed her. She'd prepared for anger, for disbelief, for questions she could navigate around. She hadn't prepared for recognition. I've known for a while, I continued, long enough to understand what happened and how. She started explaining then, not all at once, in waves, stress, bad decisions, a belief she could fix it before I ever needed to know. She used words like temporary and intended and never meant to. I let her speak, not because I needed the details, I already had them, but because this wasn't an interrogation. It was a closing statement, hers. When she finished, there was a long pause. She looked at me the way people do when they expect a verdict. I didn't deliver one. Instead, I said, I'm not here to debate motives. I'm here to be clear about outcomes. That was when the temperature in the room changed. Outcomes don't care how you feel about them. I trusted you with our savings, I said evenly, and the account went down to 0. That's the fact. Everything else is context. She tried again, this time softer. Tears, but controlled. Apologies, but unspecific. Promises, but future-oriented. She wanted a path that led back to normal, back to repair, back to the version of me who would absorb shock and rebuild quietly. I listened, then said, I'm not angry. That surprised her more than anything else. I don't feel rage, I continued. I feel resolved, and those aren't the same thing. She asked what that meant. I took a breath, not to steady myself, but to mark the transition. It means I've already taken steps to protect myself, I said. It means I won't be pooling finances again, and it means I won't be participating in a relationship where transparency arrives only after collapse. There it was. No insults, no threats, no raised voices. Just boundaries, spoken plainly, without apology. She asked if there was anything she could do. That was the moment when many people are tempted to soften the truth, to leave a door cracked out of kindness, to offer hope they don't intend to honor. I didn't do that. No, I said, not in the way you're asking. She asked if I was leaving. I paused, not for effect, but for accuracy. I'm disentangling, I said. Carefully, respectfully. I won't make this public. I won't humiliate you, but I won't carry this with you anymore. She cried then, not theatrically, not manipulatively, just grief, realizing too late that stability doesn't mean infinite forgiveness. I didn't reach across the table. That wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. Comfort, in that moment, would have blurred the message. And the message needed to be clean. This isn't punishment, I added. It's alignment. I can't unknow what I know, and I won't pretend I can. She asked how long I'd known. Long enough, I said. She asked why I didn't say anything sooner. I considered that question carefully, because it deserved an honest answer. Because I needed to be sure, I said. And because I needed to make decisions without being rushed into forgiving something I hadn't fully understood. There was no argument after that, just silence, the real kind, the kind that arrives when explanations are exhausted and reality has nothing left to negotiate. We talked logistics, Calmly, slowly. Who would move out first? How we'd handle shared obligations in the interim. I offered fairness without generosity, distance without hostility. At no point did I raise my voice. At no point did I insult her. At no point did I ask for anything back that couldn't be returned. That mattered to me, because dominance doesn't come from volume. It comes from composure, from being unmovable without being cruel. When the conversation ended, there was no dramatic exit. I stood, collected my notebook, and said, "I hope you understand this wasn't about catching you. It was about choosing myself." She nodded, still crying. I believe she understood, at least partially, and that was enough. I didn't walk away feeling victorious. I walked away feeling intact, and sometimes that's the strongest outcome available. I didn't rebuild my life all at once. There was no dramatic reset, no sudden transformation that made everything feel lighter overnight. What happened instead was quieter and more durable. I stopped living inside a version of myself that required constant explanation. In the weeks after the separation began, my days became simpler. Fewer conversations, fewer negotiations, less mental noise. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd spent managing ambiguity until it was gone. I moved into a smaller place, not temporary, intentional. I wanted space that reflected my values, clarity, order, autonomy. I brought only what I needed. The notebook came with me. So did the habits that had always grounded me. Early mornings, long walks, work done without shortcuts. People noticed the change before I named it. Friends said I seemed lighter, though nothing about my circumstances suggested relief. What they were noticing wasn't happiness, it was alignment. I wasn't performing stability anymore. I was living it. I didn't speak badly about my ex-wife, not because I was protecting her, but because I didn't need to define myself against her choices. The story had already resolved internally. External validation felt unnecessary. What surprised me most was how my silence changed tone. Before, silence had been interpreted as passivity. Now, it carried weight. When I spoke, people listened, not because I spoke more, but because I spoke with precision. I no longer filled in gaps out of politeness. I let pauses stand. That shift followed me into every area of life. At work, I stopped accepting vague answers. Not aggressively, just consistently. Clarity became my default expectation. When it wasn't met, I didn't argue. I adjusted. In relationships, platonic and otherwise, I paid attention to how information moved. Who volunteered the truth? Who delayed it? Who treated trust as something to be honored, not managed? I didn't become guarded. I became selective. The betrayal didn't make me cynical. It made me calibrate. I still believe in partnership. I still believe in shared futures, but now I understand that love without structure is faith without grounding. And I no longer confuse calm with consent. The man I am now isn't harder. He's clearer. I know my boundaries. I respect my instincts, and I no longer shrink to preserve someone else's comfort. Reliability is still part of who I am, but it's directed inward first. That's the difference. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about control over what you allow to remain undefined in your life. I didn't lose myself in what happened. I found the version of myself who doesn't need to be underestimated to be steady. And that version isn't invisible anymore. There's a temptation, at the end of stories like this, to look for a villain, someone to point at, someone to simplify into a lesson. But real life doesn't work that way. And if it did, the lesson wouldn't be worth keeping. What happened to me wasn't the result of one cruel decision. It was the result of many quiet ones, made possible by assumptions I never challenged. Trust was given freely, but structure was never built around it. Love was present, but accountability was deferred. And that combination is fragile. The truth I've learned, one I didn't want to learn this way, is that trust doesn't mean absence of visibility. It means shared visibility. When only one person sees the full picture, the partnership quietly dissolves into management. I don't regret being calm. I don't regret being patient. But I do regret confusing silence with virtue for as long as I did. What saved me in the end wasn't anger or confrontation. It was clarity, the willingness to sit with uncomfortable facts long enough to understand them fully, the discipline to act without spectacle, the resolve to exit a situation without becoming someone I didn't recognize. There was no revenge in this story, no humiliation, no public reckoning, just consequences, applied quietly, consistently, and without cruelty. And that matters, Because the goal of self-respect isn't dominance over others, it's alignment with yourself. It's being able to look back and know that even under pressure, you didn't abandon your values to satisfy your emotions. If you take anything from this, let it be this. If something feels undefined for too long, it's not because clarity is impossible. It's because someone benefits from the blur. Pay attention to what you're not being shown. Notice where explanations arrive late. And understand that asking for clarity is not a betrayal of trust. It's a requirement of it. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to be exposed to be strong. Sometimes, the most decisive thing you can do is stop participating in confusion. If this story resonated with you, even uncomfortably, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, only to realize later that the silence cost you something important? Share your thoughts in the comments.